Hi, this is Steve Bunnacountry from SOA Consulting Services, and this is a tutorial on Angular 4 data binding. Okay, what is data binding? It allows you to connect data from the application to the UI. For example, you can display string or expressions in a template using this expression syntax, or it's also called interpolation, or the double curly bracket. For example, an H1 tag could render hello and the value of the name using the double curly brackets. The name is an attribute of the component, and as that changes, there's a one-way binding between the attribute and the value that this double curly bracket yields. Also, you could bind HTML element properties using brackets. So the span property hidden using the square bracket could be bound to the isValid attribute of the backend component. Once again, the component has an isValid attribute, and its value will determine whether this span tag is hidden or not. You could also bind events with parentheses. For example, if you have a button and it gets clicked, you could invoke a getUserInfo method of the component. The left paren syntax here represents the type of event. The getUserInfo is a method of the backend component of the corresponding template. What does this look like architecturally? Okay, Angular 4 supports one-way binding by default. So you could have a web page and you could have an app root, and here's your Angular application. It's really a component template where when you have a component with attributes and you use directives to bind those attributes in the template. For example, a left curly bracket name says whatever the value in the component is, dynamically render it on the template. Also, and that's the same for isValid, the property binding goes from right to left in these two scenarios. The span is hidden based on the isValid Boolean value in the component. When an event or a button is clicked and the click event occurs in this template, this left paren and right paren has bound the event to a getUserInfo function in the component. And that relationship goes from template to component. Now, a lot of people get confused right away. Well, we're going both ways, but each binding is one way by default. This event handling happens to go from template to component. The attribute data binding is going from the component to the template. And of course, directives make all of this happen. Okay, so there's different data binding flavors. There's event binding to invoke an event handling function, attribute binding to update an HTML element's attribute, property binding to update the value of a DOM element's property, template binding to transform the view template, and two-way binding with ng model. So one thing I want to point out here, because it gets a little confused, it gets a little bit confusing. Well, Angular 4 is trying to do things as fast as possible. If it could update a DOM property without updating the corresponding attribute, and the user could see the value in the result on the front end, it will do it. So keep in mind that a DOM object has properties. One of those properties is its attributes, and you got to be very careful about what's being modified and what's not. In addition, if you look at template binding to transform the view template, there's different directives which add DOM elements, remove DOM elements, and there's different new scopes that are created during these iterations in rendering the front end, and you've got to be aware of those issues and that functionality and those new scopes to be able to program effectively. On the other hand, if you're using some of the features right out of the box, it's simple. Don't worry too much about it. Okay, and there's two-way binding with the ng model, which means component attribute gets changed. You update the view on the template. If a value visually on the template gets changed, it propagates back to the component. So we use the ng model to implement the two-way binding. Okay, so let's look at event binding. You have a button, you have this notation here which says, when is a click event? Invoke this function. So the user sees this in a button. When they click it, this method gets invoked. This method has to be a method which exists in the backing component. But then again, it's a component template. Think of it as one component template, and you're building this thing that works. And Angular's doing all the stuff for you behind the scenes, all the magic. Okay, also you could have an input and say, well, the input event occurs, invoke the onInput function of the component. Okay, functions are invoked each time an event is triggered. So let's look at this particular markup. Basically what you have is an event name which is the target of the binding. The input event is the target of the binding, and then you have the component's method that gets invoked. This parentheses denotes the event binding. This expression to execute when the event occurs. So typically you could have an empty function, or you could pass the native browser event object to the function. And the function could say, oh, here's an event. What's the target? What's the value? Blah, blah, blah. Okay. Property binding. This is a tricky picture here. Okay, so HTML document is made up of tags and attributes. A DOM object, the browser instantiates the HTML elements at DOM objects that have properties and are rendered on the web page as UI. So the DOM and its properties get mapped to the UI. The browser is always looking for changes in the DOM properties, and it automatically renders those on the UI. As the DOM's node's properties change, the page is re-rendered. So that it's important to understand that the browser's doing certain things and Angular's doing certain things. And Angular's doing whatever it needs to do, and the browser's automatically doing things as well. So you'll find that when you start coding, things start working and you're happy and all that other stuff. But when you have a problem, you start to wonder why does this not work? And it's because of some of these things we're trying to explain here. But we'll go through some examples. Okay, so if you have a statement like input type equals text, value equals Steve. It's required. The browser creates JavaScript object in HTML input element whose properties are type, which is a string, value, which is a DOM string, and required, which is Boolean. And notice the browser will synchronize the rendered values with the values of the DOM. So once you have that HTML input element, the way Angular wants to work is, wait a minute, all I have to do is change the values of the DOM, and the user will see something different. So this is what we're trying to point out here. So let's go through the property binding. Okay, there's certain use cases, but if we look at one of them, the component needs to reflect the state of the model in the view. The parent component needs to update a property of its child. Let's focus on the first one. Suppose you have the input, and in square brackets you have the attribute value, and you're setting it equal to name. Okay, in the component, first, if you change the name value, Angular will update the DOM using one-way property binding. So the input element dot value will be set to Steve. That's the DOM node in the JS realm. The browser renders the DOM node value. So notice how Angular says, up, you're changing this, I changed the DOM node value. Why? Because the browser is going to update the rendered value. Okay, let's look at the next type of binding, the attribute binding. You have attributes in an HTML document like hidden and styles, etc. So when you do the binding, you say input attribute that value equals name. In this scenario, you change the name value. Angular updates the HTML element using one-way attribute binding. Then the browser syncs the HTML value with the DOM. And then the browser syncs the DOM value with the UI. Okay, template binding are structural directives that modify the DOM by adding and removing elements. For example, ngIf, conditionally add or remove an element from a DOM. ngSwitch adds one element to the DOM tree from a set of possible elements. ngFor iterates through an array, adding each element to the DOM. So we have shortcut syntax for the directives: start ngFor, start ngIf, start ngSwitch. When Angular parser sees a directive with the star, it converts the directive into an HTML fragment that uses a template tag. Two-way binding keeps the view and model in sync. The long way would be input a value with the square bracket equals name, and on an input event, invoke the onInput event with the $event. Meaning, when I click a button or anything that invokes the input event, the onInput event function of the component can be invoked, and the event could could extract the value from the event and update the attribute name in the component. When the attribute name of the component is updated, the value of the input tag will be updated. So instead of having to implement that with one-way binding, this being one way towards the component, this being one way back to the template, you could use a short way by using the left bracket, the left square bracket, and the left round bracket syntax, and say ng model name. Then the input tag, the component template would use two-way binding from the component attribute called name to the template, and when you change the input value, that in the Angular app on the web page, that will update the name attribute in the component. And the event handled is driven by an Angular class called control value accessor. So two-way binding goes both ways. I type in a name, it goes to the component. I change the component, it goes back out to the template. Once again, this is a directive, and this is the syntax you use. So let's go through examples. These are some binding examples. One of them, we talk about basic attributes and properties. That's the binding example. We have a binding template where we use directives like ng-for, ng-if, ng-switch. And we get binding two-way, which is a two-way binding example. So stay tuned for the next video, which will go through all the examples.